Welcome to Islington Mill and, the monthly podcast series about the cultural life and times of one of the UK's most beloved artist-led creative centres, Salford's Islington Mill. I am the Nihilist, your host for the show. It is September 2023, and for this month's podcast I'm joined by two guests to talk about the sex worker-led creative collective and performance happening cabaret gathering shindig known as Sexquisite. I'm not going to spend too much time explaining to you what Sexquisite is and what they do, because my guests Natalie and Maeve are very articulate, and it's better to let them explain to you, the listener, what Sexquisite is and what it is that they do. I will give a slight trigger warning at the start of this episode though, just to go, we are going to be talking about sex and sex work, not in any kind of trauma based way or talking about negative things like that. We're keeping this conversation very positive, but just so people know, there will be these fairly frank discussions of sex work, and one or two sex acts here and there are going to get discussed over the course of this show. I do want to make it clear as well though at this stage, even though I've put that trigger warning there, that this is a very positive conversation about sex work and sexuality, and we're keeping things very much within the sex positive zone, because too much of the media documentation of the lives of sex workers and the sex work that they engage in, it's really based in kind of trauma porn. For cis-normative, heteronormative society, the kind of default view of sex work is that it's somehow wrong and that the people who do it are somehow flawed, and that's the reason that they do it, which is not actually the reality of these things. So I just wanted to put that at the front of this discussion about Sexquisite and the sex work-led collective that it is, just to keep people informed of what's going to be coming up in the podcast. And that's enough of me rabbiting on about this. I'm going to hand over to myself now and my guests from the Sexquisite collective. So I'm joined in the studio today by Natalie and Maeve from Sexquisite. How's it going?
It's going great, yeah.
Yeah, it's going well. We're here today to perform for Fat Out Festival, which we're really excited about.
Oh, cool. What are you doing?
We're hosting a cabaret, so we have 6 performers, including ourselves. So I'm performing some poetry, Natalie's doing some music, we've got some burlesque, some dance, and some rap.
Yeah, it should be great. Yeah, we have a new host for this round of Sexquisite compared to our usual host, so it's going to be Felix.
Felix Mofty, and he's in the new season of Sex Education, which is on Thursday.
Yeah, I know Felix, he's great. So, first things first, what is Sexquisite?
So Sexquisite is an arts company platforming sex worker artists across cabaret, theatre and nightlife, and we're committed to offering sex workers paid creative work and using art as a tool to impact meaningful change. Okay,
cool. What was the impetus for starting it?
So I was at drama school and I had to put on an event. I had a previous history working as a sex worker, and I just had a random idea. I was like, I wonder if there's other sex worker artists out there, because I'm a poet, actor and theatre maker. Put a call out and got a crazy response. Put on the first event, even though my teacher told me no one would come, and to do it in my back garden. I phoned up loads of venues, and they seemed keen on the idea of having a feminist cabaret. Mm-hmm. But when I mentioned sex workers were involved, they phoned me back and be like, oh my god, I'm so sorry, something's come up in the diary. So it was really hard getting it off its feet. But the first event went really well, and since then we've written plays, performed them, delivered writing workshops, theatre workshops, and we mainly do cabaret shows in London, Manchester and Bristol.
Okay, cool. Is it, do you find that reaction to when you bring up the fact that it's involving sex workers quite common?
It was when we first started. I think before you start having like a bit of clout and a bit of like excitement around the brand or the collective. So now like we're welcomed by venues, because venues just care if they're going to get a good bar spend out of you. But I think initially, before people believed in the concept, then we had a lot of resistance.
Yeah. Do you feel that being so sex worker led gives what happens during a cabaret a different take on things that might not be there in a non-sex worker led cabaret? Do you know what I mean?
I think we are we are a small and very shut on community of people, and I think having a place for people to congregate, I think is very important. I think also a space that explicitly says that it's safe for sex workers is so important. I think in a lot of ways, like, just even in queer environments, you'd still have to deal with potential swerves. You still have to deal with people who would, that feared question of what do you do for work when you bump into someone at a show. And if you're at a show where the primary focus is sex workers, you're just not going to get that as much. And if you do, you kind of need to look around and be like, you know where you are right now.
Yeah, definitely. Just to pull up, Natalie mentioned the term SWERF, which stands for Sex Worker Exclusionary Radical Feminist.
Yes, I was going to ask what that means.
And unfortunately, lots of women that consider themselves feminists fall under that bracket because they believe that sex work is bad and, comes from, like, obviously a place of, like, misogyny and inflicts violence upon women, but it's not a very nuanced sort of view on sex work, and we believe that real feminism is sex worker inclusive. But also, just to go back to that point, I think Sexquisite's important because we create spaces that celebrate sex workers rather than stigmatise them, and we create spaces, like Natalie said, that are safe outside from the real world, where sex workers are put on stage and they're celebrated and the audience are cheering for them, and it's like the one space where it's ours, and we're inviting non-sex workers to come into that space and to sort of share our experiences with us through art.
It seems kind of queer in that aspect, in terms of it's a space where that particular identity or that occupation isn't necessarily questioned or judged.
Absolutely, and lots of us are queer as well. So it is a queer collective.
In the general industry of sex, it is a very queer industry. It's primarily run by queer people. So I think to be exclusionary of queer people in a sex worker movement would just kind of contradict itself a bit. So,
do you feel that, like, mainstream attitudes towards sex work is changing?
A little bit, but I get worried that we exist in an echo chamber. But I do believe Sexquisite is actually impacting meaningful change in the way, even like Social Proof, right? You come to our shows and it's often between like 150 to 250 people, and if one person leaves and has a positive conversation with someone else about, I saw this show and I learned this and I learned about sex worker rights and activism and why we need to support the decriminalisation of sex work, then that is positively impacting change and it's contributing to the destigmatisation of sex work.
And also just to, like, see people who are sex workers not in sort of these rogue interviews of from TV and all these people on Twitter and Instagram, just to actually see that sex workers are people and they're people that you see every day. They have other jobs, they're serving you a coffee, they're sitting next to you. Just to see that they aren't these weird fictional people that the mainstream media kind of blows them up to be. I think is very important.
Yeah, definitely. And we're multifaceted and multi-talented, and we're artists before sex workers. And saying that we're sex workers sells tickets, but ultimately we want to platform ourselves as artists and for people to experience our art. And lots of us are just doing sex work to support our artistic career because the state of the arts world in the UK is a bit
I think there's still so much stigma, not just around sex work in and of itself, but around sex in general. Where the minute, like, the phrase sex is thrown up, it's kind of like this kind of, like, I don't know, like a glowing, flashing thing, and certain people see it and it kind of just spins them out. Do you know what I mean? It's just like, as soon as sex is brought up, it's like people kind of, don't exactly lose their critical faculties, but something happens where they're like, oh, sex. It's... I don't know how to articulate what I'm trying to say.
No, absolutely.
You know what I mean?
And there definitely is a rise in, like, a sex positive movement, and we'll talk about Riot Party later, which I co-founded, which is a play party which is sex worker and POC led. But yeah, still, even when I tell, like, friends from uni what I'm up to now and I'm running these two sex positive sort of organisations, they look so shocked, and it's like almost like, or like, even I went to quite a prestigious drama school and I see lots of my colleagues that are doing things in the school platforms then, and I'm doing loads of cool things, but because it's related to sex, like it's only platformed in a very specific way. I don't know, it's not given the same sort of credibility. You mentioned the phrase sex positivity there. Could you just, for the sake of our listeners, assume that they don't know what that means, and just could you explain what that means, or maybe even what it means to you personally?
Yeah, I think sex positivity just generally means a positive attitude towards sex. I think it's a liberal attitude towards sex. I think it's celebrating queer sex. I think it's celebrating people with disabilities who have sex. It's just, you know, it's celebrating consenting adults who have sex without, completely disregarding shame altogether. I think especially kind of growing up around in the US around a lot of religious shame, and especially a lot of people who grew up in very conservative households where they were just, they didn't feel like they could explore their bodies or their sexualities, sex positivity, discovering that, I think, is revolutionary for a person.
Yeah.
And with the access to the internet and finding movements and finding all the people that are preaching things that you thought weren't even fathomable, I think it's just, it's uplifting.
Yeah.
Sex is great. It rocks.
Exactly.
Yeah, it should be safe, and people should be able to have access to birth control and abortion, and be able to feel safe doing it. And people should be educated about it as well.
Absolutely. I hope with the rise of sex positivity we'll get a better sex education. I don't know what your education was like in school.
Oh God,
but it's so bad, right?
Yeah.
We were literally shown a slideshow of like all of these STIs, and it's like, I don't know if you know Mean Girls, where it's like, don't have sex because you will get pregnant and you will die.
My sex education was abstinence only, and that was It was just kind of like, it was just all of us sitting in a classroom and them just saying, they're like, open a book and it's like, what do you do if you want to have sex? And they're like, don't do it, you'll die. You'll die horrible death. Just repress everything, don't do it.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, okay.
Great. Healed.
I'm just thinking back now, I don't think we actually had specific sex education classes at my school. I went to a school in Ireland in the 90s. I think most of the quote unquote sex education that we got was just from each other.
Wow.
Was just talking about stuff, and like teenage boys, most of that is absolute bullshit.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like,
Absolutely. I grew up with porn, and that's really damaging, and having to unlearn how to have sex after growing up with porn, and growing up with, like, I'm bisexual but was sleeping with men or boys at the time that are learning from porn as well, and it all becomes very performative, and it's like each relationship I have been in with a man, there's like a whole few months of unlearning before we have like actual good sex.
Yeah, can I just gauge age-wise, did you both grow up as adolescents when internet porn was freely available? Because I didn't. I got online in like the mid-2000s, and that's when I started to really... I knew stuff was out there, but I only got access to like the internet when I was almost in my late 20s. So it was like finding all this stuff that I knew was out there. It was great, but it's always... I'm just like, oh my God, what must it be like if you were like 11, 12, 13, hitting puberty, and all that stuff was already there for you to access? Like, are you both of that generation?
I'm 25, and I first watched porn when I was 11.
Yeah, I'm 24. I think a friend in a classroom when I was like 10 showed me something showed me something on a computer one time in the school library. It didn't have any child proofing on it whatsoever. And that was a bit, I would say that was a bit harmful.
Definitely.
Definitely.
It's interesting as well, Natalie, you're American.
Yeah.
When I was growing up and when we were growing up, America always seemed like a much more sex positive place than either Ireland or the UK. But would you, I don't know, now that you live here, how do you find attitudes around that stuff is different, or?
Well, most forms of sex work in the US are illegal. There are, I think, in the state of New Jersey, I think I looked it up when I was thinking about a few weeks ago. I thought I was going to get, my visa wasn't getting renewed. I'd have to go back, and I looked, and I read that being caught exchanging sex for money is punishable by up to 15 years in prison.
Wow.
So I think, in a way, I think sex, like a lot of things in the US, are very much controlled, advertised and produced by patriarchal forces, by capitalism. I think
an oppressive justice system.
Yeah, I think sex positivity should 100% be led by sex workers.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a place can't be sex positive if sex work is illegal.
Yeah.
So I think considering that, I moved when I was 18, so I'd never really had access to the kink scene because the drinking age is 21.
Okay.
So I never, and I just, when I go back, I'm staying with my mom and my dad, so I don't really, I don't go like, oh, I'm gonna go out for a coffee and then like slip on the latex and like anything. I would say where it's good. In cities, it's lively. You meet all types of people who have there are events. There are great communities, but where it's bad, it's very bad.
Yeah.
In very suppressed areas of red states, and especially I have family in the deep south, and I have cousins that go to Catholic school, and what they're told and what they are brainwashed with about the ideas of sex, I think, are so far from the reality. And I think, it's a vast place. I can't kind of generalize all of the US.
Yeah, fair enough. The UK is a lot smaller, though. How do you find the attitudes and stuff here?
I think because it's so small. Now, obviously, I think because it's so small, it is kind of accessible to be able to, if it just like, it is accessible to just get an hour train to a city in which you can access these events and these places and these libraries of people to wise up. I think in the US, you can just be in this desolate area with no transportation, with no resources whatsoever except the internet. And if you're if you're a minor, if you're trying to if you're living at home, if your parents or your community kind of heavily restricts your access to the internet and the outside world, you are just stranded. I think in the UK, there's always going to be someone from a different city that lives near you, that has moved to your town, that can tell you about what they've seen outside of your little bubble.
Hopefully. I say that I grew up in a small town called Frome in Somerset, and it was so slut-shamey, and they're so backwards. I got bullied so bad. I got fingered once in year 8, and I was and there were girls who had done way worse because they had long-term boyfriends or whatever. I just had this horrible reputation of being a massive slut, and almost got slut-shamed into being a slut. So I was like, okay, cool. This is who I am now. And if someone tells you you're something for long enough, you start to believe it. It's kind of interesting that my career is based in these sex positive events now. It's I wonder if that didn't happen, if I would have been so. But I'm very passionate about the idea of anti-slut shaming. And creating space. I think it's really harmful.
I do think the UK is overall very prude.
So
I think prude. I think it's especially I moved to London recently, and it is just a lot of people are very snobby and prude. There is no sexual attention on the tube, and that is upsetting. It's very boring.
People are a bit more buttoned up here, I guess.
Yeah.
It's just interesting for me because when I was a kid growing up, any ideas of queer movements or LGBT movements or anything like that, it was all coming from America, and especially stuff like Riot Girl, queercore, and stuff like that. It seemed like that was the hotbed of where all that kind of progressive movementism was coming from. And it is interesting as I get older and meet actual Americans and talk about it, and just that was maybe happening in certain spots, but in general, America is not, I don't know, it seems actually in reality a lot less illiberal than what I perceived it to be growing up. And I think a big part of that has to do with just the production of porn. It was just the vast majority of porn that was out there that I was accessing when I was able to and stuff. It was all coming from America, and there was very little that was coming from anywhere else, really. So in my brain, it was oh, they love shagging over there. They're all into it and stuff. But then speaking to people, and it's not that straightforward, I don't think.
Well, yeah, I think a lot of the Right Girl movement, I think it's just it's women and trans and non-binary people who are very much driven to that point. Kathleen Hanna, Kathleen Hanna, father was like a huge misogynist, and just like, you know, it just like, and also just like her countless attempts at like, you know, being part of the music scene and just like being shot down by sort of men in bands. I think kind of, you know, you get driven to that point. And I think also just like not being able to just generally talk about sex as a woman, like, you know, just like as it being this huge taboo in these very like concentrated, stale like suburban communities and rural communities in the US. It's just like these people rise up from it. Yeah. And they
I mean, I'm not doubting that the UK is more prudish. I definitely feel that. But is there anything more positive about sex culture here in general than you think in America, maybe?
Well, it's hard to compare because I don't really have a lot in the US to compare except for kind of my disdain in America. I would like if it was off the back of my head, I would just say that I prefer it here. That's what I wanted to say. I think.
Why would you prefer it here?
Because I think that just the fact that sex work, just like, even though it's heavily regulated and the government makes it like very difficult, I think a lot of these spaces, the best spaces, the safest spaces, the spaces for younger people, for diverse crowds, for these parties and these communities are run by sex workers, and they're run by people who are openly sex workers. I think, and I think that's important. I think just like the best understanding of people who of sex are people who work in sex.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think it is like, I have been in a lot of spaces in the UK that I feel very safe in, especially as a sex worker. Okay. And I think that would be hard to find, and I think also just I would not be able, even though I'd be in a space where everyone's fucking and everyone's doing kinky shit. If I was in the US, if I openly said that, like, if I openly said the type of work I did, like, people even if they were in that space in the US, because it's so stigmatized and because it's illegal in the US, it would be a shock to them. It would take people back. People might not want to sleep with me all of a sudden because they think it's dirty. They think it's morally wrong. Yeah. Even though they're like, literally fucking on like a concrete floor in a fucking warehouse somewhere. Be like, I just don't want to get shamed at the orgy. Yeah. Nobody wants to get shamed. I don't want to get shamed at the orgy, and I feel like if I was going to get shamed at the orgy anywhere, it would definitely be in the States. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've been to New York for a week almost 20 years ago, so I really know like real experience of what life is like in the States. But it's just, when I was growing up, all the cool stuff was coming from America. Right. And attitude-wise as well, like queer liberation and like kind of the kind of harder edge of feminism and Riot Girl and stuff like that. But like I said, it is kind of interesting to hear that. But I think you also made the point that America's vast. Yeah. And I think that's something that we over here don't really appreciate that much, because everything that arrives here from America, quote unquote, is just quote unquote American, so it's just seen as this kind of homogenous thing or this homogenous place, and we don't really get how each state is nearly the size of this country, kind of thing. Like New York City isn't all of the US. LA isn't all of the US. And I'm not saying that, and I'm not saying that every single part of the the UK is welcoming and wonderful. I just came from Doncaster today, and I was thinking like, it is like great nightlife. But I think besides that, I was definitely thinking like, I don't think this place is a really good sex dungeon. Yeah. Another thing I wanted to pick up on what you said, Maeve, about getting slut shamed at school. Yeah. So I'm like in my mid-40s now, so my experience of being at school was almost 30 years ago. Another kind of perception that I have is that the younger generations are getting much more sex positive and chill about that stuff, but then hearing that you were getting sex shamed for just one incident is like, oh right, so also maybe that's a misapprehension that I have.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was rife at school, and I think so many AFAB people that I speak to have had similar experiences. And I started doing sex work quite young. And then when people found that out, the bullying got 10 times worse. And so it's this weird thing of like they force you into a position, and then you do make some money off it, and then it's even worse and you're even more stigmatized. And I see a lot of like attitudes on TikTok from younger people and younger boys chatting shit about girls that do OnlyFans, and like these jokes about oh god, I could never date an OnlyFans girl, someone that sells her pussy online, or like these sorts of attitudes that I think like that still exists, and it's still really harmful. And this idea that you can't be in charge of your sexuality.
There's a weird power dynamic thing happening there, I think, where men and AMAB folk, people who are socialized as male growing up, are kind of very subconsciously taught that we should hold all the power, and they're so willing, like, or straight pan by men who have sex with women, or AFAB people. There's this thing there where they can't really admit to themselves that actually someone who is that attracted to them holds power over them. And they constantly have to try and denigrate that power and kind of subtly, no, maybe even not subtly, just overtly, kind of using that shame tactic to deny the power that this thing has over them. It's a kind of denial kind
of... How the like sexual attraction has over them.
Yes, exactly. So that when they're like I was just listening to a thing last night, it was ContraPoints. Do you know ContraPoints?
No.
They're transgender YouTube video essayists. They're probably the best known transgender video essayist. But they were in conversation with this gay chap. It wasn't a chat show, but they were just talking. It was just like a one-to-one chat. And they were talking about how conservative transgender women, who are like on the right politically and in the Republican zone or whatever, still have lots of Republican men commenting on their validity as women, even though they express sexual attraction to them.
Right.
So they're like, oh, I find her sexy, or I don't, trigger warning, but I find quote unquote him sexy, but it's blatantly a trans woman. And they're like, does that make me gay? And it's like, from my point as a homosexual man, I'm like, stop being an idiot. Of course that doesn't make you gay. Like,
idiots,
your attraction is to femme, and you're masked, so it's the opposite. So how can that make you gay? But it's this thing where it's like, they can't process the fact that they're attracted to someone who, they then question their gender identity. It's just, I don't know where I'm going with this really, but I think there is a kind of underlying power thing there that men and AMAB people raised as male, we're never overtly taught it, but we're very subconsciously taught that we hold the power and we hold the reins and the keys. So when something comes around to disrupt that, and to me sex is one of the great things because it's so, you don't have to, it's so physical and immediate, and attraction and that kind of stuff, you don't have to intelligent it or use your intelligence to work out why. It's a very physical reaction thing. So when that happens to somebody and to a man, and they feel like it's crossing this threshold of power, or they feel like they're losing power in some way, I think they try and push back at that by questioning the validity of the thing that they're finding attraction to, rather than questioning their own attraction.
And that's so true, and it's the same sort of reaction as like when someone like moves to you or comes onto you, they're like, oh my god, you're so hot, and you're like, sorry, I'm not interested. Like, oh, you fucking whore. And it's like, okay. Yeah.
I mean, I have sex with a lot of men, so I'm very used to dealing with men in terms of that's where I get my sex from, but also I'm a cis man, I'm AMAB, and I've never had to deal with that kind of like, you do get it a little bit, but I think that like women and AFAB people and femmes get it so much worse in a way that that masculine folk don't even know, because we're not out there getting that stuff and hearing stuff like that.
Definitely.
It's like, it's interesting. It's a bit grim, but it is kind of interesting.
And it's so internalized. Like I find myself with partners now, like not wanting to talk about other sexual experiences I've had, or being like, oh, I'm only seeing you, or like, and like really fixating on that like it would matter, or like even if it just because I'm busy, but like making it sort of like I have to check myself and just
I'm so pure and
I'm so good and I only want to sleep with you, but it's like actually I'm just really busy and that's why. But I'm presenting it to you as if it's like a personality trait that's going to make me more likable. And like it's just I still do that even though I actively know that is wrong. And like men and people raised masculinized, whatever the correct phrase for that is, but we never have to think about that because there is no stigma for a man in being a slut, for want of a better word. What's the word? Being a slut. Being a slut.
Himbo is a new term.
Yeah.
Himbo. I quite like himbo.
Yeah.
What does himbo mean?
Like a bimbo, but him.
It's a male bimbo. Yeah.
I love it.
That's been around since the 90s, by the way. Keanu Reeves is the original himbo.
I'm just a little Gen Zer. So fully youth in life.
Himboism hasn't reached TikTok yet.
Come for my throat, won't you?
You mentioned earlier about like Sexquisite is a space for sex positivity, and could you tell me like in general terms, not on any like specific detail, but like the really positive experiences that you've had coming out of that, like seeing people's minds being changed?
Yeah, so starting with the community, one experience recently was a girl that's come to perform with us. She lives in rural Wales and has had a horrific experience just existing as a sex worker, getting beaten up in her town for having OnlyFans and girls' boyfriends subscribing. She can't even tell people where she lives, like really estranged from her family. And she said coming to work with Sexquisite has changed her life. And I think that feels really important that we're creating spaces like that. For me, it's meant a lot. I was like kicked out of my friendship group when people found out. My family were really weird. I've had like run-ins with the criminal justice system and just being able to like be around people and share experiences and just being with people that get it. Yeah, I don't know. I met Natalie in, was it lockdown? Yeah. We were doing online shows and even meeting Natalie and like working together and forming like collaborative and artistic bonds as well. Like Natalie reached out to us and was like, oh, I think Sexquisite would be really cool in Manchester. We really need like a space for that. So Natalie's responsible for bringing Sexquisite to Manchester. I don't know if you want to talk about your experience with Sexquisite.
Yeah, it changed my goddamn life. It did. I think, well, when we had that kind of Zoom, that Zoom show, up until that point, I had never been in a space. I've never been kind of face to face with a room full of people openly saying that they were sex workers, and that was kind of mind blowing for me a bit. I was just, even though it was just on a Zoom call, I felt very seen. So, and I think from that point, I think what I originally wanted to do, kind of like an ulterior motive I had, was not only wanting to bring it to Manchester because I knew that there were sex workers in Manchester, but I just couldn't, at the time, I just didn't know where the community was for them. I didn't know where, like, I was just like, I was thinking, like, if we can, like, gather people here, that would be sick. If we can open up this, this community here, that would be great. Because there weren't really any events, I couldn't find at least, someone tell me if there was, and I just wasn't, paying attention. But I could not find any events that were exclusively for sex workers. And yeah, I think once we had that first event, I was so thrilled. So I was like volunteering with Partisan at the time, and I kind of fell in love volunteering at Partisan, and I really enjoyed Sexquisite, so I just had this like evil plan in my head and just combine them both and make a little love child out of both of them. So I convinced Maeve to do an intimate show at Tiny Partisan at the time, the one that was in the Unit 2. It was itty bitty, 80 cap, on 10's licensing. And it sold out in 2 days. Wow. And it was sick, and it was amazing, and the energy in the room was just fantastic. and then I kind of clung to you like a little barnacle after I wanted to do it again and again.
Oh, we have been doing it again and again.
Yeah, we have.
And it's really exciting to connect with more artists like in and around Manchester.
Yeah.
And creating that space and seeing other sex worker led events crop up in Manchester, which is really important. I like to think that maybe we helped inspire that, and I think it's really important to forge more communities, and so sex workers can take over the world.
Exactly. What you said about you weren't aware. I feel like I didn't see anything that was explicitly sex worker led until Sexquisite as well. And that gives us a nice little segue into, you talked about other parties that are also sex worker focused.
Yes.
What's Riot Party?
So Riot Party is a queer sex positive rave and also play party, and ultimately we're just trying to build a community of queer kinky folk that are like-minded, and we're like anti-slut shaming, intersectional, and a space for people to explore sex safely, consensually, and just with an open dialogue, and really pushing forward this like we're talking about sex positivity and just having a positive attitude about sex. So we're sex worker and POC led. I'm obviously the sex worker led part of it, and then my partner Alex, he'd been exploring the kink scene for a few years and noticed the lack of diversity within the scene and felt like lots of spaces were extremely white, and also he's got a background as a music promoter, and he always felt that like lots of the parties were only playing like techno and stuff like that, so we wanted to create a party that was multi-genre. I wanted to bring in sex worker performers and provide paid opportunities to sex workers, and just having a sex positive sort of kink space that was sex worker led, because as Natalie said earlier, sex positive spaces should be run by sex workers because it is our job and we know how to do it best.
It also isn't just full of a bunch of cool Berkheim Berlin kids. It's like, it's silly, it's camp. Sex should be silly in camp. I don't think I could bounce my titties enough during a techno set.
Exactly. We just want to create like a really like not cliquey space, and a space where everyone's welcome, and like our events are heavily like monitored and staffed, and then the training we do with our monitors, like one of the main things is like if someone's alone, like go chat to them, and we really want to build community and just like everyone is welcome. And I think at lots of kink parties they do feel a bit exclusive and a bit exclusionary, and so Riot is like, even if you have no experience of kink or you're not even sure if you want to do that, come along, because it's a rave first and foremost. There's a playroom if you want to go, but it's just about having fun and having a party in your underwear, basically.
It's also not stupid expensive, which is great. It's not cool. It's not £50.
We want to make it accessible, I'm working class, and like back in the day before I did sex work, because sex work is very helpful, but like you're not able to access these sorts of events. You can't afford to buy a really expensive ticket and buy loads of drinks.
So just to round it off then, tell me when the next Sexquisite and the next Riot Party are happening. I know that there's one tonight.
So we're
but beyond that, because this isn't going to go out tonight.
So we're at Fat Out today, which is going to be great. Tomorrow we have Riot Party, which probably the podcast won't be out in time.
No, unfortunately. Damn, I didn't know actually. But
you should come.
Yeah.
It'll be a good time.
And then do you want to talk about Sexquisite next?
Yes.
Just before we do, where is Riot Party? Just give details.
It's a Rebellion in Manchester, which is an accessible venue.
Okay, cool.
In Deansgate.
Cool.
Yeah. And the next Sexquisite will be for my event that I put on, which is Jezebel, and it is for our Halloween edition, October 21st, called Lilith and Coven, because Lilith was a Jezebel and a witch. So it's going to be the combination of a Jezebel and a gathering of witches, and it's gonna be. Last time it was the event that nearly killed me, but it's so worth it. Last time we had an entire kiddie pool of lube, and
I think I've seen pictures of that.
Did you hear about that? Yeah, that was me in that pool of lube. It was a good time. We had.
And you nearly died.
No. And we have bands, and we have Sexquisite artists, and it's just going to be general witchy vibes, kind of movie screening.
Is that at Partisan?
It is indeed
Okay,
a partisan.
cool. Yeah.
On
And then
the
we have on the 21st.
of October.
Yeah.
And then we have a Christmas show on the 2nd of December, and the venue's to be announced for that.
Okay.
Sexquisite, so Sexquisite Christmas Cabaret.
So plenty of opportunities, but come to my event. It's gonna be hot.
And on that note, thank you very much.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
You've been listening to Islington Mill, and I've been your host, The Nihilist. And for this month's episode, I've been speaking to Maeve and Natalie from Sexquisite. You can find Sexquisite online on Instagram. That's sexquisite.events. SEXQUISITE EVENTS. And you can also find Riot Party on Instagram at Riot Party UK, which is RIOTPARTY UK. Right, I'll be back next month. Have a good one.